Speaking from 21 South Street.
I can still hear the birds chirping. Oh, how I love hearing to them. Looking back on the 2 years I spent in London, I realize that it must have been the most restless period of my life, judging from the number of lodging houses and residential districts I lived in. Belsize Park, Haverstock Hill, Swiss Cottage, Tooting, and a couple of other places whose names I've forgotten. I don't quite know why, but I was never long in any one boarding house. And unlike a Graham Greene character, I wasn't trying to escape from sinister pursuers, unless you could call Nirmala a sinister pursuer. This good-hearted girl, the sister of an Indian friend, took it into her head that I needed a sister and fussed over me so much and followed me about so relentlessly that I was forced to flee my Glenmore Road lodgings and move to South London for a month. I preferred North London because it was more cosmopolitan with a growing population of Indian, African, and continental students. I had initially tried living in a student's hostel for a time, but the food was awful. There was absolutely no privacy. So I moved into a bedsitter and took my meals at various snacks bars and small cafes. There was a nice place near Swiss Cottage where I could have a glass or two of sherry with a light supper, and after this I would walk back to my room and write a few pages of my novel. My meals were not very substantial, and I must have been suffering from some form of malnutrition because my right eye started clouding over and my sight was partially affected. I had to go into hospital for some time. The condition was diagnosed as Eales disease, a rare tubercular condition of the eye, and I felt quite thrilled that I could count myself among the greats who had also suffered from this disease in some form or another. Keats, the Brontes, Stephenson, Catherine Mansfield, Ernest Dowson, and I thought, if only I could write like them, I would be happy to live with a consumptive eye. But the disease proved curable, and I went back to my job at Fortex on Charlotte Street, totting up figures in heavy ledgers. Adding machines were just coming in, but my employers were quite happy with their old ledgers, and so was I. I became quite good at adding pounds, shillings, and pence for hours, days, weeks, months on end, and quite contented to, provided I wasn't asked to enter the higher realms of mathematical endeavor. Maths was never my forte, although I kept reminding myself that Lewis Carroll, one of my all-time favorites, also wrote books on mathematics. This mundane clerical job did not prevent me from pursuing the literary life, although for most of the time it was a solitary pursuit, wandering the streets of London and the East End in search of haunts associated with Dr. Johnson, Dickens, and his characters, W. W. Jacobs, Jerome K. Jerome, George and Whedon Grossmith, Barry Kensington's Gardens, Dickens' Dockland, Gissing's Mean Streets, Fleet Street, old music halls, Soho and its Greek and Italian restaurants. In these latter, I could picture the melancholic 1890s poets, especially Ernest Dowson, writing love poems to the vivacious waitress who was probably unaware of his presence. For a time, I went through my Dawson period wistfully, dreaming, wallowing in a sense of loss and failure. I had even memorized some of his verses, such as these lovely lines. They are not long, the days of wine and roses. Out of a misty dream, our path emerges for a while, then closes within a dream. Poor Dawson, destined to die young and unfulfilled. A minor poet dismissed as inconsequential by the critics, and yet with us still a singer of sad but exquisite songs. A little down the road from my office was the Scala Theatre, and as soon as I had saved enough for a theatre ticket, I went to see the annual Christmas production of Peter Pan, which I had read as a play when I was going through the works of Barrie in my school library. This production had Margaret Lockwood as Peter. She had been Britain's most popular film star in the 40s, and she was pretty and vivacious. I think Captain Hook was played by Donald Wolfett, better known for his portrayal of Vengali. My colleagues in Fortux, though not in the least literary, were a friendly lot. There was my fellow clerk, Ken, who shared his Marmite sandwiches with me. There was Maisie of the auburn hair, who was constantly being run up by her boyfriends. And there was Clarence, who was slightly effeminate and known to frequent the gay bars in Soho. And then there was our head clerk, Mr. Smeddy, who had been in the Navy during the war and was a musical theatre buff. We would often discuss the latest musicals, Guys and Dolls, South Pacific, Paint Your Wagon, Pal Joey, big musicals, which used to run for months, even years. The window opposite my desk looked out on a huge hoarding, and it was always an event when a new poster went up on it. Weeks before the film was released, there was a poster of Judy Garland in her comeback film, A Star Is Born. And I can still remember the publicity headline, Judy, the world is waiting for your sunshine. And of course, there was Marilyn Monroe in Niagara, and Marlon looking much bigger than the waterfall, and that fine actor Joseph Cotton nowhere in sight. My heart, though, was not in the Fortex office. I had no ambitions to become head clerk or even to learn the intricacies of the business. It was a 9-to-5 job giving me just enough money to live on while I scribbled all my evenings working on the second draft of my novel. How I worked at that book! I was always being asked to put things in or take things out. At first, the publishers suggested that it needed filling out. Then I filled it out. I was told that it was now a little too descriptive, and would I prune it a bit? And what started out as a journal and then became a first-person narrative finally ended up in the third person. But the editors only made suggestions. They did not tamper with my language or style. And the feel of the story, my love for India and my friends in particular, was ever present, running through it like a vein of gold. Much of the publishers' uncertain and contradictory suggestions stemmed from the fact they relied heavily on their readers' recommendations. A reader was a well-known writer or critic who was asked to give his opinion on a book. My manuscript was sent to the celebrated literary critic William Atkins, who said I was a born writer and likened me to Sterne, but also said I should wait a little longer before attempting a novel. Another reader, Leslie Lamb, said he had enjoyed the story, but it would be a gamble to publish it. Fortunately, Anthony Dell was the sort of publisher who was ready to take a risk with a new, young author. So, instead of rejecting the book, he bought an option on it, which meant that he could sit on it for a couple of years until he had made up his mind. My mentor at this time was Donna Stephan, Dahl's editor and junior partner. She was at least 10 years older than me, but we became good friends. She invited me to her flat for meals and sometimes accompanied me to the pictures or the theatre. She was tall, auburn-haired, and attractive in a sort of angular English way. Donna was fond of me. She could see I was suffering from malnutrition, and she was a good cook. She shared her very pleasant and wholesome meals with me. There is nothing better than good English food, no matter what the French or Italians or Chinese may say. A lamb chop, a fish nicely fried, cold meat with salad, or shepherd's pie, or even an Irish stew are definitely more satisfying than most of the stuff served in continental or Far Eastern restaurants. I suppose it's a matter of childhood preferences. For deep down in my heart, I still fancy a kofta curry because koftas were what I enjoyed most in Granny's house. And oh, for one of Miss Kellner's meringues, but no one seems to make them for me anymore. I really neglected myself during the first year I spent in London. Never much of a cook, I was hard put to fry myself an egg every morning before rushing off to catch the tube for Tottenham Court Road, a journey of about 25 minutes. In the lunch break, I would stroll across a snack bar and have the inevitable baked beans on toast. There wasn't time for a more substantial meal, even if I could afford it. In the evenings, I could indulge myself a little with a decent meal in a quiet cafe, but most of the time, I existed on snacks. No wonder I ended up with a debilitating disease. Perhaps the first relaxing period of my London life was the month I spent in the Hampstead General Hospital, which turned out to be a friendly sort of a place. I was sent there for my Ailes disease, and the treatment consisted of occasional cortisone injections to my right eye. But I was allowed, even recommended, a full diet supplemented by a bottle of Guinness with my lunch. They felt that I needed a little extra nourishment. Wise doctors, those. The bottle of Guinness made me the envy of the ward, but I made myself popular by sharing the drink with neighboring patients when the nurses weren't looking. One nurse was a ravishing South American beauty, and half the ward was in love with her. It was a general ward, and one ailing patient named George, a West Indian from Trinidad, felt that he was being singled out for the experimentation by the doctors. He set up a commotion whenever he had to be given a rather painful lumbar puncture. I would sit on his bed and try to calm him down, and he became rather dependent on my moral support, insisting on my presence whenever he was being examined or treated. While I was in hospital, I got in a lot of reading, wrote a short story, and received visitors in style. They ranged from my colleagues at Fortex to Donna Stephen, my would-be publisher, to some of my Indian friends at Hampstead, to my latest landlord, a motherly sort who had lost some of her children in the Hitler's persecution of the Jews. When I left the hospital, I was richer by a few pounds, having saved my salary and been treated free on account of the National Health Scheme. The spots had cleared from my eyes, and I had put on some weight, thanks to the lamb chops and Guinness that had constituted my lunch. Before I left, George, the West Indian, asked me for my home address. But for some strange reason, I did not expect to see him again. You were listening to Days of Wine and Roses by Ruskin Bond from The Adventures of Rusty.